The fluorescent lights of Martha's diner buzzed with that familiar electrical hum that Sarah Chen had learned to tune out after 3 years of opening shifts. 5:30 in the morning, and the place smelled like burnt coffee, disinfectant, and the ghost of yesterday's meatloaf special. She tied her apron around her waist, the fabric worn thin at the edges, and started the same routine she'd done 1,000 times before. Fill the coffee pots, check the sugar dispensers, wipe down the counter even though it was already clean, because Martha would check and Martha always found something to complain about. Sarah's feet already ached in her second-hand sneakers, and her shift hadn't even officially started yet. Outside, the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania was still asleep, the main street empty except for a stray cat prowling near the hardware store. This was her life now. Wake up at 4:45, be at the diner by 5:15, work until 2 in the afternoon, then head to her second job at the grocery store until 9 at night, rinse and repeat, 6 days a week. Her student loans from the nursing program she'd had to drop out of weren't going to pay themselves, and her mother's medical bills kept piling up like snow in a blizzard that never ended. The bell above the door chimed and old Mr. Patterson shuffled in, same as every morning, wanting his black coffee and wheat toast. Sarah poured his cup before he even sat down at his usual spot at the counter. He grunted something that might have been thanks. Then came Miss Rodriguez, with her book club friends, loud and laughing about some romance novel. Then the construction workers heading to the new development on the edge of town. The morning rush, if you could call it that in a town of 4,000 people. Sarah moved through it all on autopilot, her hands knowing exactly where every plate, every cup, every fork belonged. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, doing the math she always did. Rent was due in 5 days. She was short by $200. The electric bill was overdue. Her car was making that sound again, the one the mechanic said would cost $600 to fix. $600 might as well have been $6 million. She refilled coffee cups and took orders, and smiled when people made small talk, all while the calculator in her head kept spinning, kept coming up with the same answer, which was that she was drowning and nobody seemed to notice or care. At 7:15, during a brief lull, Sarah leaned against the counter and closed her eyes for just a moment, just one moment of not moving, not thinking, not calculating how many extra shifts she'd need to take to keep her head above water. That's when the bell chimed again. She opened her eyes and straightened up, reaching for a menu automatically. The man who walked in looked completely out of place. Everyone who came to Martha's diner was a regular. Everyone knew everyone. This man was a stranger, and in Millbrook strangers were noted. He was older, maybe 65 or 70, with silver hair that looked expensive somehow, and a wool coat that definitely didn't come from the outlet mall 2 towns over. But his shoes were scuffed and his face had deep lines etched around the eyes, the kind that came from either lots of laughter or lots of worry. He sat at the counter, 3 stools down from Mr. Patterson, and picked up the laminated menu with hands that trembled slightly. Sarah grabbed the coffee pot and walked over, flipping a cup right side up on the saucer in front of him. The stranger looked up at Sarah with eyes that were pale blue and somehow sad, the kind of sad that lived deep down where words couldn't reach it. He smiled though, and it transformed his whole face for a second. "Coffee would be wonderful. Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough like he hadn't used it much lately. Sarah poured and waited, pen poised over her order pad. The man stared at the menu for a long time, longer than anyone should need to decide between pancakes and eggs. His hands were definitely shaking now. She noticed other things too. His coat was expensive, but it had a stain on the sleeve. His shirt collar was crisp, but he'd buttoned it wrong, one side higher than the other. There was something off, something that made Sarah's nursing instincts kick in even though she'd never finished the program. This was someone who wasn't okay. "Take your time," she said gently. The man looked up at her again, and something flickered across his face. Gratitude, maybe, or relief that she wasn't rushing him like the world always rushed everyone. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm having trouble deciding. Everything looks good." Sarah could tell it wasn't about the food. She'd seen this before with her mother, after the stroke, the way simple decisions became mountains too steep to climb. The way the brain just stopped cooperating with what should be automatic. The breakfast special is popular, she offered. 2 eggs any style, bacon or sausage, hash browns and toast. Comes with coffee and juice. The man nodded slowly. That sounds perfect. Scrambled eggs, please. And bacon. Sarah wrote it down. You visiting someone in town? She asked, making conversation the way waitresses did. The man's face did something complicated. I used to live near here. Long time ago. I'm just passing through. Wanted to see it again. There was a story there. Sarah could tell. A heavy one. But before she could respond, Martha's voice cut through from the kitchen. Order up, Sarah. And those salt shakers aren't going to fill themselves. Sarah rolled her eyes and the stranger smiled, a real smile this time. Conspiratorial. She went to grab Mr. Patterson's toast and deliver it, then moved through her other tables, but she kept glancing back at the man. He sat very still, both hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he was trying to absorb its warmth. When his food came up, she brought it over and set it down. Here you go. Can I get you anything else? He looked at the plate like it was a puzzle he needed to solve. Then he reached for his coat pocket, reached again, patted his other pocket. His face went pale. He started, then stopped, patted his pants pockets, the breast pocket of his shirt. I thought I had. Sarah knew that look. She'd seen it on her mother's face too many times. Confusion, panic starting to creep in at the edges. The man looked up at her with those sad blue eyes now swimming with something close to desperation. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I don't have my wallet. I was sure. His voice trailed off and he just sat there, staring at the eggs getting cold on the plate in front of him, looking more lost than anyone should look in a small-town diner on a Tuesday morning. Mr. Patterson was watching now. So was Mrs. Rodriguez. In a town this small, everyone noticed everything, and this would be gossip by lunchtime. The old man who came in and couldn't pay, who didn't belong. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. She knew what it was like to be one bad moment away from everything falling apart. She knew what it was like to not have enough, to feel like the world was watching you fail. Sarah made the decision in about 2 seconds, which was probably the fastest and most reckless financial choice she'd made in years. She reached into her apron pocket, where she kept her tips, pulled out $8 in crumpled ones and loose change, and set it down on the counter next to the man's plate. It's on me today, she said, keeping her voice low so Martha wouldn't hear from the kitchen. Don't worry about it. The man stared at the money like it was something foreign, something he couldn't quite comprehend. I can't. You don't have to. It's just breakfast, Sarah said, with a shrug she didn't feel. $8 was $8. That was a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread. That was a little bit closer to making rent. But looking at this man's face, at the way his hands had stopped shaking and the relief that was flooding into his eyes, Sarah knew she'd made the right choice, even if it was the stupid choice. Are you sure? He asked, and his voice cracked a little. I'll pay you back, if you give me your address. I can send. Really, it's fine, Sarah interrupted. Just eat your breakfast before it gets cold. She turned away before he could argue more, before she could second-guess herself, before Martha could emerge from the kitchen and ask questions. She went back to her other tables, refilled coffee, took an order for waffles from the construction crew, cleared plates, wiped down booth seats, normal things, routine. But she was aware of the stranger at the counter, the way he ate his eggs slowly and carefully, the way he kept glancing over at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she came back to refill his coffee, he spoke again. What's your name? He asked. Sarah, she said. Sarah Chen. Sarah Chen, he repeated, like he was committing it to memory. I'm Robert. Nice to meet you, Robert, she said, and meant it. They didn't talk much after that. Robert finished his breakfast, drank 2 more cups of coffee, and sat there for a while, just watching the diner come to life around him. The morning rush picked up, what passed for a rush in Millbrook anyway, and Sarah got busy with the regulars and their usual order. She almost forgot about Robert, until she turned around and found him standing right there at the register, looking more composed than he had when he'd first arrived. Thank you, Sarah, he said, and the way he said it made it sound like more than just thanks for breakfast, like it was thanks for something bigger. "You're welcome," she said. "Take care of yourself, okay?" He nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "You're a kind person," he said. "The world needs more people like you." Then he was gone, the bell chiming as the door closed behind him, and Sarah watched through the window as he walked down Main Street and disappeared around the corner. She stood there for a moment, feeling oddly empty, like something significant had just happened, but she couldn't quite name what it was. "Sarah," Martha's voice snapped her back to reality. "Table 4 needs their check, and those ketchup bottles aren't going to marry themselves." Sarah shook her head, pushed the whole strange encounter to the back of her mind, and went back to work. The rest of her shift blurred together the way shifts always did. Take orders, serve food, clear plates, smile, repeat. By 2 o'clock when she clocked out, her feet were screaming and she had exactly $43 in tips for 7 hours of work, minus the 8 she'd spent on Robert's breakfast. She changed out of her uniform in the tiny bathroom, shoved it in her backpack and headed out to her car for the 20-minute drive to the grocery store, where she'd spend the next 7 hours, scanning items and bagging groceries, and pretending she had the energy to care about whether paper or plastic was better for the environment. 3 days later, Sarah was in the middle of her usual morning shift when Mrs. Rodriguez came rushing in like her hair was on fire, her book club friends trailing behind her. "Sarah, Sarah, you have to come see this. There's a car outside, a fancy car, and there's a man in a suit asking for you." Sarah's first thought was that something had happened to her mother. Her second thought was that maybe the credit card companies had finally sent someone to physically collect what she owed. Either option made her stomach drop. She set down the coffee pot and followed Mrs. Rodriguez to the window, where half the morning regulars had already clustered to stare outside. Parked directly in front of Martha's diner, taking up 3 parking spaces and looking like it had landed from another planet, was a black Mercedes that probably cost more than every car in Millbrook combined. A man in an expensive suit stood next to it, looking at a piece of paper in his hands. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. This couldn't be good. Nothing good ever showed up in a car like that. She pushed through the door, the bell chiming, and the suited man looked up. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of polished appearance that came from having money and knowing it. "Sarah Chen?" he asked. "That's me," Sarah said, crossing her arms. "What's this about?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a threatening smile. If anything, he looked almost excited. "My name is David Morrison. I'm an attorney representing Robert Harrison. He asked me to find you." "Robert?" "The stranger from 3 days ago, the one who couldn't pay for his breakfast. Is he okay?" Sarah asked, worry flooding through her. The attorney's smile widened. "He's fine, more than fine. He wanted me to deliver something to you personally." He reached into the car and pulled out an envelope, a thick envelope, the kind that meant important documents or bad news. Sarah took it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, written in shaky but elegant handwriting, and attached to it was a check. Sarah looked at the check first because her brain couldn't help but calculate numbers before anything else. Then she looked again. Then she stopped breathing. The check was for $500,000. $500,000. "This has to be a mistake," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's no mistake," the attorney said gently. "Mr. Harrison was very specific. He wanted you to have this." Sarah forced herself to read the letter, though her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. The words swam in front of her eyes, but she managed to make them out. It read, "Dear Sarah, 3 days ago I walked into a diner, having forgotten everything that mattered. I've been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, and that morning I had wandered away from my hotel without my wallet, without my phone, without any way to help myself. I was confused and scared and felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my 70 years on this earth. You showed me kindness when you had every reason not to. You gave me $8 that I suspect you couldn't afford to give. You treated me like a person who mattered when I was starting to wonder if I still did. I spent my life building a technology company that I sold 15 years ago for more money than I could ever spend. I've donated millions to charities and foundations and causes, but in that diner, eating eggs that you paid for, I realized something. The most valuable gift anyone had given me in years was your simple act of human kindness. I don't have children. My wife passed away 5 years ago. My sister tells me I need to start giving away my money while I still remember why it matters, so I'm giving some to you. This is not charity. This is payment for reminding an old man that kindness still exists in the world. Use it however you need. Pay off debts. Go back to school. Help your mother. Live your life without the weight that I saw in your eyes that morning. With gratitude, Robert Harris. Sarah read the letter 3 times while standing on the sidewalk with the attorney watching her patiently and Mrs. Rodriguez and half of Millbrook peering through the diner windows. The check felt impossible in her hands, like it might dissolve if she blinked too hard. $500,000 from a man she'd spent maybe 20 minutes with total, a man she'd given $8 to because it was the right thing to do, not because she expected anything in return. This can't be real, she said again, looking up at the attorney. I promise you it's very real, David Morrison said. I've handled Mr. Harrison's affairs for 10 years. He's extremely wealthy, and he's very serious about this. The check will clear. I can answer any questions you have. Sarah's mind was spinning too fast to form coherent questions. Behind her she heard the diner door open and Martha's voice, sharp and suspicious. Sarah, what's going on out here? You've got tables waiting. Sarah turned to see her boss standing there with her arms crossed, taking in the Mercedes and the suited attorney and the envelope in Sarah's hands. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah didn't feel the automatic stab of anxiety at Martha's tone. I quit, Sarah heard herself say. The words came out clear and strong, surprising even herself. Martha's eyes widened. You what? I quit. I'm done. I'm giving you my 2 weeks' notice right now. Except actually, I'm not. I'm giving you 2 hours' notice. I'll stay until the lunch rush is covered and then I'm leaving. Martha's face went through several colors. You can't just quit. I need you. Who's going to cover your shift? I don't know, Sarah said, and she felt something like laughter bubbling up in her chest. But it's not going to be me anymore. She turned back to the attorney. Is there anything I need to sign? Anything official? Not right now, he said, pulling a business card from his pocket. But call me next week and we'll set up a meeting with a financial advisor. Mr. Harrison wanted to make sure you have support in managing this responsibly. Sarah took the card, carefully folded the letter and check back into the envelope, and held it against her chest like it might fly away. The attorney got back in the Mercedes and drove off, leaving Sarah standing there on the sidewalk with the entire town watching. She went back inside, finished her shift in a daze, barely aware of the whispers and stares. When 2 o'clock came, she untied her apron for the last time, hung it on the hook in the back, and walked out of Martha's diner. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 10 minutes, just breathing. Then she called her mother. Mom, you're not going to believe what just happened. She drove to the bank, check in hand, convinced the teller would tell her it was fake or a mistake or some kind of elaborate prank, but the bank manager came out personally, verified the check, and opened an account for her. The money would be available in 3 business days. Sarah walked back to her car and sat there in the bank parking lot, watching the numbers on her phone calculator. $500,000. She could pay off her mother's medical bills, all of them. She could pay off her own student loans. She could fix her car, pay 6 months of rent in advance. She could go back to nursing school. She could actually finish her degree. She could have a future that wasn't just survival mode every single day. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Chen cried, not because things were terrible, because, suddenly, impossibly, they weren't. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her tiny studio apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that morning with Robert. She kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream. Finally, at 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and opened her laptop. She typed Robert Harrison, Billionaire, into the search engine and hit enter. The results flooded her screen. Robert Harrison, founder and former CEO of Harrison Technologies, a software company that had revolutionized data security in the early 2000s, sold to a larger tech conglomerate for $3.2 billion. That was billion, with a B. Articles about his philanthropy, pictures of him at charity galas with his late wife, Catherine. A recent interview where he'd spoken publicly for the first time about his Alzheimer's diagnosis and his decision to give away the majority of his wealth before the disease progressed. Sarah clicked on the interview, published just 6 weeks ago. Robert's face filled her screen, those same sad blue eyes looking at the camera. "I don't want to die having forgotten why money matters," he was saying. Catherine always said that wealth was only meaningful when it made other people's lives better. "I'm running out of time to remember that lesson, so I'm acting on it now while I still can." The interviewer asked about his criteria for donations. Robert had smiled. "I'm less interested in big organizations, and more interested in moments, in individuals, in the kind of spontaneous human kindness that reminds you what it means to be alive." Sarah closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes. Robert hadn't been some confused old man who wandered into the wrong diner. He'd been testing something, looking for something, or maybe he really had just been lost and scared, and she'd happened to be the person who showed him kindness in that moment. Did it matter? The money was real. The letter was real. The change in her life was real. She opened her laptop again and found the website for Millbrook Community College. They had a nursing program. Classes started in January. She could finish her degree. She could become the nurse she'd always wanted to be. Over the next few days, Sarah moved through the world in a haze of disbelief. She met with the attorney, David Morrison, who introduced her to a financial advisor named Patricia, who spoke to her like an adult, like someone whose opinions mattered, like someone who had a future. They set up accounts, made plans. Patricia gently suggested that Sarah not tell everyone in town the exact amount of money she'd received, and Sarah had laughed because half of Millbrook already knew, give or take a few $100,000 in the rumor mill. She paid off her mother's medical bills in one transaction that took 5 minutes and made her mother cry so hard, Sarah worried she'd have another stroke. She paid off her student loans, fixed her car, paid her rent 6 months in advance, and watched her landlord's eyebrows climb toward his hairline. She enrolled at Millbrook Community College for the spring semester. She bought her mother a new wheelchair, the expensive kind with proper support. She donated $5,000 to the food bank where her mother had gotten groceries during the worst times, and through it all, she kept thinking about Robert, about the look on his face when she'd put that $8 down on the counter, about how sometimes the smallest gestures mattered more than anyone could predict. 2 months after the check cleared, Sarah drove 3 hours to Pittsburgh to the address David Morrison had given her. It was a memory care facility, the expensive kind with gardens and art therapy, and staff who looked like they actually cared. Robert was sitting on a bench in the courtyard when she arrived, feeding breadcrumbs to sparrows that hopped around his feet. He looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile, but when he saw her approaching he smiled, that same smile that transformed his whole face. "Sarah," he said, and she was relieved he remembered her name. "You came." "Of course I came," Sarah said, sitting down next to him on the bench. "I wanted to thank you in person." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the birds. Sarah noticed Robert's hands were steadier than they'd been at the diner. Maybe it was a good day. Maybe the medication was working. Maybe some moments were just clearer than others. "I heard you enrolled in nursing school," Robert said. "David keeps me updated. I hope that's not too intrusive." "It's not intrusive," Sarah said. "I start in January. I'm going to finish my degree this time." "That's wonderful," Robert said. He threw another handful of crumbs and the sparrows swarmed. "Catherine wanted to be a nurse, you know. Before we met, she gave it up when I started the company, needed her help with the business side. She always regretted it." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "Don't be. She lived a good life. We had 42 years together, but I think she would have been happy to know that your kindness let you pursue what she could." Robert turned to look at her directly. "I need you to understand something, Sarah. That morning at the diner, I was having a bad day, a scary day. I'd wandered away from my hotel and I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Everything felt wrong and confused and I was terrified. Then you treated me with such simple dignity, like I was just a person who needed help, not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed." His eyes were bright with tears. In that moment you gave me back my humanity. $8. That's all it took. $8 and basic human kindness. Do you know how rare that is? How precious? Sarah felt her own tears starting. I just did what anyone would do. That's exactly the point, Robert said gently. You think anyone would do it, but they don't. Most people don't. They look away. They judge. They assume. But you saw someone who needed help, and you helped. No questions. No expectations. Just kindness. He reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a photograph. It was old. The colors faded, showing a much younger Robert with a dark-haired woman who must have been Catherine. They were standing in front of a small restaurant, both wearing aprons, both laughing. This was our first business, Robert said. Before the tech company, a little cafe in Seattle. We ran it for 3 years. Lost money every month, but we loved it. Catherine used to comp meals for people who couldn't pay. I'd get mad at her, tell her we needed every dollar if we were going to survive. She'd say that kindness was worth more than profit. He smiled at the memory. She was right, of course. That cafe failed, but it taught us something more valuable than business success. It taught us about people, about community, about what actually matters. 6 months later, Sarah Chen sat in her anatomy and physiology class at Millbrook Community College, taking notes on the cardiovascular system and feeling more alive than she had in years. She was maintaining a 4.0 GPA. She'd made friends with other students, actual friends who invited her to study groups and coffee that she could now afford. Her mother's health had stabilized with the better medications they could now access. Life hadn't become perfect, but it had become possible. During lunch, Sarah checked her phone and saw an email from David Morrison with the subject line, "Thought you'd want to know." She opened it. The message was brief. Robert Harrison had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 nights ago. There would be a small memorial service for family and close friends. David had attached a copy of Robert's obituary from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Sarah read it twice, her throat tight. The obituary talked about his business success, his philanthropy, his late wife, his contributions to technology. But there was a quote at the end that caught her eye. It was from an interview Robert had given just a month ago, apparently one of his last. "I've been rich and I've been poor," Robert had said. "Well, not really poor, but I've been afraid and lost and confused. And I've learned that the moments that matter most aren't the ones where you're giving from abundance. They're the moments when you give from scarcity and do it anyway. Those are the moments that change the world, one small act at a time." Sarah closed her eyes and said a quiet thank you to a man she'd only really known for about 30 minutes total, but who had changed the entire trajectory of her life. That evening she drove to Martha's Diner. It was 5:30, the dinner rush just starting, and through the window she could see the new waitress, a teenager named Emma, rushing around with the same stressed expression Sarah used to wear. Sarah walked in and the bell chimed. Martha looked up from the register and frowned. "We're busy, Sarah. If you're here to gloat, I'm here to eat," Sarah said calmly. She sat at the counter, 3 stools down from where Robert had sat 6 months ago, ordered the breakfast special even though it was dinner time, because that's what Robert had ordered. When Emma brought her food, Sarah watched the girl's tired eyes, the way her hands shook slightly from exhaustion, the worn sneakers that had holes in the soles. Sarah knew that exhaustion had lived. When Emma brought the check, Sarah pulled out $300 in cash and set it on the counter. "The meal was great," Sarah said. "The rest is for you." Emma stared at the money. "I can't. This is too much." "It's exactly enough," Sarah said. "Trust me." She left before Emma could argue, walked out into the cool spring evening, and drove home to study for her exam. She thought about ripples in water, how one small act of kindness had saved her life, how Robert's moment of being lost had found them both, how Emma might now have the chance to pay rent on time, or fix her car, or take one less shift and get 1 more hour of sleep. The world didn't change all at once with grand gestures and billion-dollar donations. It changed in diners at dawn when someone paid for a stranger's egg. It changed when people chose kindness over convenience, generosity over scarcity. Connection over indifference. Sarah Chen had learned this from a billionaire who forgot his wallet. She'd learned it from $8 that became 500,000. She'd learned it from a life that had gone from drowning to breathing in the space of one simple choice. And now, sitting at her kitchen table with her anatomy textbook open and her mother asleep in the next room, and a future stretching ahead that looked nothing like the one she'd imagined 6 months ago, Sarah made herself a promise. She would remember that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about, that kindness costs nothing and changes everything, that the smallest gestures matter most, that we're all just people trying to find our way, and sometimes all it takes is someone willing to buy you breakfast and treat you like you matter, because you do matter. Everyone does, even on the days when you forget your wallet and can't remember where you are and the world feels too big and confusing to navigate. Especially on those days, Sarah closed her textbook and looked at the photograph she'd framed and hung on her wall. It was from Robert's obituary, him and Catherine in front of their little cafe, young and hopeful, and not yet knowing where life would take them. Below it, she'd written something on a small card, just 8 words that she read every morning. Be kind. You never know who you're saving.